Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the first webinar in our Threat-Informed Defense series on threat simulation. Cyber threats pose significant risks to organizations worldwide, ranging from financial loss to reputational damage to operational disruptions. These ever-evolving threats can be intimidating and scary, but with the right preparation, organizations can proactively mitigate risks and fortify their overall cybersecurity posture. Our goal is that you walk away from this webinar feeling educated and empowered, understanding threat simulation principles and practices that can make a pivotal difference in how you safeguard your assets against cyber threats. My name is Amelia Lewis, and I am the marketing specialist here at Kirkpatrick Price and your host for today's session. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. To ask questions, please be sure to use our chat, and we'll review those during the Q&A at the end. If you would like CPE credit for this webinar, please be sure to email hello@kirkpatrickprice.com, should be on the screen for you, and we'll send you a certificate. And finally, this session is being recorded and you'll receive the recording in your inbox later this week. I think that is everything. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker. Hey, Jason.
Hello.
Jason Rowland, hi. Jason Rowland is a cybersecurity executive with over 20 years of experience leading the delivery of security programs and defense strategies, operational capabilities, and assessments. As VP of Pen Testing at Kirkpatrick Price, Jason is focused on providing cyber solutions that support the success of his clients and participating in initiatives to strengthen our community. Welcome, Jason. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you, Amelia, for that excellent introduction. As Amelia mentioned, this particular webinar is going to be a part of a series of 3 webinars that we do that will all be focused on concepts that fall under the umbrella of a threat-informed defense. So we'll be talking about threat simulation today. And then on May 29th, we'll be joined by Michael Bonner. He is someone that I've worked with for many years in the past. He's one of the best blue team thinkers and network defenders that I've had the honor to work with. And then our final webinar will be on threat hunting. Amelia will get all of the dates for those out here at the end of the webinar. What we're going to be discussing today is really, we're going to be talking about threat simulation, but it is really covered under the umbrella topic of a threat-informed defense. Threat-informed defense is something that the MITRE Center for Ingenuity has really been driving forward over, I would say, the last 5 or so years. And what it's defined as, and this is what the MITRE Center for Ingenuity defines it as, is it is a systematic application of a deep understanding of adversary tradecraft and technology to improve cybersecurity. So what does that mean? In the simplest terms, it is, a threat-informed defense encourages us to understand the adversaries that are most likely to impact our environments, understand the tactics, techniques, and procedures those adversaries employ in infiltrating our environments, and then shaping our defenses and our detective measures around those actual TTPs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then what we're covering in this webinar in particular is how we use testing and evaluation to validate that we are able to defend and detect against the tactics and techniques that are employed by those threats. The threat-informed defense is really, it is possible because of attack. If you're not familiar with MITRE ATT&CK, I believe that the team has pinned the link to the entire attack framework in the chat, and it should be something that you could reference, and I would reference. The attack framework is essentially a curated knowledge base of cyber adversary behaviors. So as over the last 10 years, as we've learned about how adversaries both break into, move through our environments, as well as how they ascertain our data and remove our data, those techniques have been captured, and they are captured, many of them, in the attack framework. And we'll cover an example momentarily. The attack framework also gives us a common taxonomy to talk about adversary actions. It's a way for red teams and blue teams to communicate using the same terms, which is extremely important. And it includes tactics, which focuses on the why. What is the objective? For example, initial access. And it also lists techniques that are associated with each one of those tactics. So if the tactic is initial access, a technique might be phishing, and a sub technique might be spear phishing using a link, as you can see here. So this is actually not the MITRE version of the attack framework. This is a smaller representation, and it's a snippet that I took from Tidal Cyber, which is another organization that I would encourage you to check out. They're doing great work in this space. But you can see how it maps out how adversaries move through our network. And if we'll focus on initial access, again, initial access is a tactic. It is an objective. Underneath initial access, in this particular instance, you have phishing, and then a sub-technique of phishing is spear phishing using a link. All of the techniques that are highlighted on this particular framework are those that are employed by Lockbit 3.0 and its affiliates. So that's where we came up with this. And then not only, I mean, we're covering threat simulation today, which is over on the far right-hand side, but you can, as you click into these techniques and sub-techniques, you will get information about how to mitigate the threat, how to, analytics that you can put in place and data sources that you can use to detect the threats. So it helps you with assessment and engineering. It also provides you a method to take raw or finished threat intelligence and map it in such a way that you and your red team or you and your defenders can communicate about how to mitigate the issues. And they also give you scores of information on analytics that you can utilize to detect these techniques. So some of our learning goals for today is we're going to cover some offensive security approaches. I want to talk about the value of threat simulation. I mean, we have a lot of offensive security services today. Why do we need another one in threat simulation? And then I want to cover the threat simulation framework, which is how we at KP employ this process for our customers. And to achieve those learning objectives, this is essentially going to be our agenda for today. Again, we're going to cover a few fundamentals that are important for understanding threat simulation conceptually. And then I am simply going to walk through our framework that we use in the delivery of that service. There will be some technical stuff, but most of this I think you should be able to follow regardless of your technical, how technically inclined you are. But my hope is that you come away with at least a framework and an understanding of how you can either engage a partner or you yourself can look at learning more about this and, and using this to assess and improve your own cybersecurity effectiveness. So first we'll cover some fundamentals. Since I've been in the industry, as Amelia mentioned, for a little over 20 years. And since the time that I've been here, I've heard these questions my entire career. Network owners, business owners, security stakeholders, they all want to understand, how is my cybersecurity effectiveness? And they may ask that question in a number of ways. They may say, are my people trained and alert? If something goes bang in the night, are they going to be able to tell me that something's gone wrong and we need to respond to it in a timely fashion? Are our internal processes effective? Anyone that's out there that does audits with KP or otherwise, this is a big part of it. We want to make sure that your processes are effective and working as expected. And are my technology investments both configured correctly and delivering the value that we originally thought they would? Well, these questions are so pervasive that they have sprung an entire industry worth of services to answer them. So we have vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, and red teaming, as well as things like configuration reviews that are technical assessments to tell us how well our defenses, our people, our processes, our technologies are able to detect and defend these threats. And I want to be clear, what we're going to be talking about today with threat simulation, it is additive to these things. Each of these things has a purpose and a place. And threat simulation is something apart from. But I do want to at least highlight the differences. Vulnerability assessment, obviously, in order to properly ascertain what your attack surface looks like and what the risk is at a high level of that attack surface, vulnerability assessments and vulnerability management is something that is extremely important for most organizations. Penetration testing also provides definitive, prioritized, actionable recommendations of things that need to be fixed based on exploitability. It is a true test of whether your patch management and configuration management programs are functioning as expected. However, penetration testing normally focuses largely on initial access vectors. So that is to say nothing of the post-exploitation post-exploitation tactics or techniques that occur after initial access is gained. That's not always the case, but often it's the case. And then you have red teaming, which what we're going to be talking about today with threat simulation is a form of red teaming. But the difference is that oftentimes with traditional red teams, you have red teamers coming in and bringing their bag of tricks to your environment and testing using TTPs that may or may not be backed by credible threat intelligence. They may or may not be the most important techniques that you should be concerned about. And furthermore, the concept of red teaming often pits red teams and blue teams against each other, and it becomes a zero-sum game of who is, if the red team is able to get into an environment, then it's winner take all, and if blue team is able to defend, and it really stifles the kind of collaboration that you need in some cases to move your cybersecurity effectiveness forward. So with all that being said, that brings us to threat simulation. And threat simulation is an intelligence-driven discipline that entails researching, modeling, executing cyber adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures to assess and improve cybersecurity. Let me unpack that a little bit better. It is really about understanding, going back to kind of our concept of a threat-informed defense, understanding what threats exist, which exist kind of, with the means and the motive to come after you and your organization and the data that you have. We want to research those threats. We want to model those threats and understand how those work inside of an environment. And then those are the threats and the associated tactics and techniques and procedures that we want to execute. The thing that sets threat simulation apart from a primary characteristic standpoint is it's always based on real world threats. This is, a mechanism to say, yes, we can focus our time and energy on all things that are possible from a cybersecurity standpoint. But what we would rather do is figure out what's probable, or what we would like to do in addition to that, I should say, is figure out what's probable and make sure that we are buttoned up. For example, if you're a healthcare organization, specifically a hospital, you know that there is there is a high probability that ransomware is what's going to come and knock on your door. What are the TTPs associated with ransomware? Let's make sure that we do deep testing of those. And let's make sure that we have defenses in place to stop those techniques. And let's make sure that we have analytics in place and hold our MSSP or our SOC accountable for being able to detect those techniques when they occur on our network. The other primary characteristic of threat simulation and MITRE ATT&CK, quite frankly, is it occurs at the top of what they call the pyramid of pain. The pyramid of pain essentially denotes that if I'm able to detect hash values that you use in a piece of malware, it's trivial to change those hash values. So it is really no cost to the adversary to change their software enough to get past those kinds of checks. If I detect based on your IP address or defend based on your IP address, again, those are easy to change. And as we work our way up the pyramid of pain, we get to tactics, techniques, and procedures. And if we base our emulation or simulation exercises, as well as our defenses and our detections on the tactics, techniques, and procedures, well, then we force the adversary to innovate, because they've essentially got to change the way that they conduct these operations. So it's very focused on the top of the pyramid of pain. And then the secondary characteristic, and this goes back to kind of the red team versus blue team, is there's no longer any reason for this to be a zero-sum game, because we know that the TTPs that the red team will be bringing in to deliver are based on real-world cyber threats. We are going to simulate exactly what those threats look like. So there's no secret bag of tricks that we'll be using. We'll be executing the test in line with the way that the adversary does, and we will be making sure that we can defend and detect against it. Okay, so threat simulation framework, again, this is our framework. It's, and again, I want to give a lot of credit to the MITRE Center for Ingenuity, the MITRE Defender training that's out there, as well as Title Cyber. There's a lot of great work going on. This is edited. This is how we conduct these activities. And this is kind of what we're going to go through with the rest of the presentation. So where we start is defining objectives, and we'll go through each one of these one by one. We'll start by defining the objectives of the engagement. Then we will do TTP and threat research. I want us to talk about simulation planning. This is extremely important, whether you are having a partner conduct this activity or it's something that you're deploying internally on your own. There's a collection of documentation that needs to be put in place before we go and emulate threats on a network of any type. So we'll talk a little bit about some of that. TT preparation, how do we go from TTP research to then getting our TTPs in a place where they are ready to execute? And then I'll talk a little bit about conducting the simulation. And finally, we'll talk about reporting results. And all of that is to say, I mean, this is not a rigid process. The example that I use here on the slide is that oftentimes when you are conducting a simulation, you may learn something that takes you back to defining objectives, or it takes you back to researching additional TTPs. All of that stuff, this is not meant to be necessarily always rigidly adhered to. It is more of guidance on conducting the exercise. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is define objectives. Again, this will be highly dependent on the industry that you're in, your business model, and the threat landscape and what it looks like at the time of conducting the exercise. So, for example, good objectives might be, will my security controls stop common tactics, techniques, and procedures used by ransomware affiliates? And you may want to test the tactic of initial access, or you may want to test execution, which is the execution of the malware once initial access is gained, or you may want to test lateral movement. Now, you can test these things tactic by tactic. You can even test one technique at a time. There's a lot of information out there on micro simulations, which is taking one technique or sub-technique and just testing that technique. And that's a fine way to approach this and kind of ease your way into it. But also you may say, can my security controls stop, or can my SOC and MSSP detect FIN11, right? So if you're in the retail space, the hospitality space, this might be something that is very important to you, and you may want to work all the way through the emulation as it relates to a specific threat. And again, further down in the presentation, we'll give some examples of what that looks like. Okay, so now you have defined your objectives. The next thing that you're going to want to do is research the TTPs and the threats that you might want to emulate as a part of the exercise. So there's a couple of things to think about, again, when you're doing adversary research is, first and foremost, you need to understand a little bit about the threat landscape and how it relates to your business. And, the example that I'll give here is, if you are a government organization with highly classified information, an organization like APT 29 may be of a concern to you. And you may want to base your simulation exercise on the tactics, techniques, and procedures of APT 29. However, if you are a healthcare provider and you know that ransomware, based on the current threat landscape, is probably has the highest probability of causing an impact to your business and to patient healthcare, then you may want to emulate Lockbit 3.0. This is not an exercise that should be taken, arbitrarily. Like this is going to take a lot of time and effort for you to go and do. So it's important that you put enough thought into it to make it the best possible exercise that's most closely aligned to your cybersecurity objectives. One of the ways to do that is start with internal research. I know that probably not everyone on this call has a threat intel team, but if you do have a threat intel team, that is a great place to start to determine what threats you should most be concerned about and how those threats employ different techniques. Another great place to start is by talking to your network defenders and system administrators, and you can ask them a question as simple as, what are you most concerned about? A lot of times these folks have their finger on the pulse of the organization. They stay up on the news and they're pretty tuned into, what could potentially impact your organization. Reviewing past incidents is another phenomenal place to start. If you've had incidents in the past, review them. A great place to start is to make sure that whatever remediations that you put in place post-incident, that those are able to stop the same threat from happening again. I can tell you that it's been more than I can count on two hands the number of times that an organization has been infiltrated using the same tactics, techniques, and procedures more than one time. So, just because that is what a past incident looked like doesn't mean that that's not what it won't look like again. And using things like simulation to make sure that you've buttoned those vulnerabilities up is a great place to start. Excuse me. Okay, so and then you've got publicly available information. You've got things like attack. If you go out to attack, you can look at all of the threat actors out there. You can map the threat actors. Title Cyber, the community edition, you can do some of the same stuff. There's actually CTI tied to every one of the techniques in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So if you click on a sub technique or a technique, it will direct you to the CTI that technique is based on. And you can read up on how it was used in the wild and how the adversary actually employed it to kind of help give you some ideas on where to start. Also, industry reports like the Verizon Data Breach Report, they have broken these down by industry. Again, this is a great place to take a look at, like, what are the most probable threats to the organization. They've also mapped the Verizon Data Breach Report to MITRE ATT&CK, I believe. If you look at the GitHub page for the Center of the Center of Ingenuity Threat Informed Defense, I believe there is a mapping to the Verizon Data Breach Report, which could be very helpful in these efforts as well. The one thing that I will say is it is very important to be wary of headline bias when you select what threats or what TTPs that you would like to emulate. And what do I mean by that? So a lot of times what happens is we see a story in the news and the story says, so-and-so company lost hundreds of millions of dollars due to this hack. Well, a lot of times in the industry, we have a tendency to chase those kinds of things and make sure that we're not vulnerable, which is not a bad thing to do. But it's also important to note that whatever is happening in other organizations, that may or may not be the most important threat that you need to make sure that you're protected against. So just be wary as you read headlines. Don't base all of your threat simulation on what the latest hack of the day is. Really take a look at your industry and the threat intel around your industry and shape it based on what will have the greatest impact on improving your cybersecurity. And then once you're complete, you kind of know you're done with this research, or when you're done with this research, you should have a handful of threats or techniques that you've shortlisted that align with your cybersecurity goals. And you should also be able to clearly communicate to all of your stakeholders what the relevance is to your organization. So that might mean talking about how a particular threat actor has impacted your industry, or how you're concerned about a specific TTP in your organization's coverage of that technique. It's very important that when you're done with this research, not only do you understand how to move the ball forward, but you know how to communicate that to your organization in a way that's meaningful and paints a picture for them. Now we're going to take the shortlisted group of threats and TTPs, and we're going to run them through one more set of selection criteria on our way to choosing the techniques that we will simulate. We've already covered relevance. That is obviously top of the the list as far as things that are important for us to make sure that we align this engagement to. The next one's available CTI. Remember, there are some threats or techniques out there that maybe only have one piece of CTI associated with them. We're going to need enough CTI to replicate that threat. So if there's not enough CTI on it, it may not be a threat that is eligible for us to simulate. The other thing is TTP complexity. There are, the bad guys, they use a lot of off-the-shelf kind of ready-to-go exploits and frameworks, and those things can be very easily and they're readily available for a simulation exercise. There may be some much more complex, in fact, there are, that's run by nation states that would take weeks or even months of development to get an exploit to simulate that particular threat. So we have to be, we also have to look at it through that lens and make sure that whatever we're trying to accomplish, we have the time, staff, and expertise to actually accomplish it. And this goes whether you're doing this yourself or if you're working with a partner. We have to assess ourselves at KP for these exact same things. It's like, listen, we could probably replicate that technique. It would probably cost too much. There's other things that we could spend time on that would be more worthwhile. Okay, so we've defined our objectives. We've done our TTP research. We've selected the TTPs that we want to employ. And now we are going to start planning the exercise. And again, we will, the reason that I put this in here is, first of all, I think it's paramount to everyone that is undertaking these engagements, but it would also be a little bit irresponsible for us to say, this is how you run a simulation exercise without showing you kind of some of the documentation that I believe you must have in place before you undertake one of these engagements. So, and that is because, listen, threat simulation, it can cause issues on a network. Let's be clear. I mean, you will be, engaging someone to, operate in the same manner that a nefarious actor would. And executing adversary TTPs without permission can obviously land you in quite a bit of trouble. So the planning components that we'll talk about, and again, all of this needs to be documented. This isn't kind of like a mental exercise. These things need to be written down in either a letter of engagement or a statement of work, or even on an internal memo that you use and pass around to the stakeholders inside the organization. But we want to talk about engagement objectives. Like we mentioned earlier, it's important to be able to describe the relevance to your organization and why you're undertaking the objectives or the TTPs, the scope, what is in scope for the test, the schedule, rules of engagement, permission to execute, which is a separate document, and a communication plan. And we'll go through each one of these just to give you an idea of what they might look like. So first, the scope. I mean, I don't want to overdo this. I think this is probably obvious to most folks, but we want to make sure that, is business unit A in scope? Is business unit B in scope? Is only one in scope? Do we only want to do this in a test environment? Making sure that we understand what assets are in scope for this is incredibly important. If we're going to be doing social engineering, we want to understand what users are in scope. Oftentimes, companies will come to us and say, we want to test finance and we want to test HR. Those are very common groups that get tested. I don't know why that is, but it's very common groups. So you want to really have all of that documented so that people can read and understand the scope of the testing that you'll be doing. You also want to understand high value assets. What assets, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be in scope. In fact, there's certainly an argument to be made that they should, but as a tester or as someone that is partnering with an organization, you want to understand what those high value assets are. You want to be aware of that. And then any assets that are specifically out of scope, which could be for, many reasons, you want to make sure that those are documented as well. Schedule, again, this is incredibly important and really speaks to the breadth of the stakeholder that you need involved in these engagements. Because what is incredibly important is that you deconflict this exercise from other key business activities that may be occurring at or around the same time. So it's why it's important that not only does the CISO know and the CIO know, but maybe you want to loop in finance, maybe you want to loop in HR because they do have something very important happening at the same time. You want to make sure that you have an approved and documented schedule so that you can deconflict any of those other key activities. And then you have a rules of engagement document. The rules of engagement document should demonstrate what TTPs are permitted. And I would highly encourage you to look for or to utilize MITRE ATT&CK as a way of visualizing those TTPs. So when you're talking to internal stakeholders, you can say, listen, this is the TTPs that we want to cover and why, and here's a graphical representation. It seems to help. You also want to make sure that your rules of engagement cover things like cohabitation of malware. What happens if we are doing a simulation exercise and we come across some other people that maybe are not authorized to be doing exercise, but we find them? What is the process for us to follow there? Sorry about that. And is there a process to deviate from scope? As we learn new things and get into the exercise itself, how do we go and approve to maybe deviate from scope if that is something that we should do? And then the final thing I would say, and this kind of goes back to cohabitation of malware, but if we do find any illegal or unauthorized activity, what is the process for that? And I would say it's probably going to have something to do with your internal incident response program. Again, I will say, you need permission to do this. You need permission to do this. And the final thing is you need permission to do this. And you should make sure that you have a document that clearly states what you will be doing and something that gives you authorization to do this work. Again, what we are doing without permission, just like a pen test, would be illegal. That's why it's important that we get the right kind of, or the right authorization and signature before we start doing this work. And then you have a communications plan. And I'll go through just a couple of things here. The communications plan should lay out when, what time do we communicate? How often do we communicate? What is our method of communication? And that should cover what's our method of normal communication. And then if we do run into something that becomes an IR incident, what is our method of communication at that point? And, we oftentimes have customers where we will go and execute the engagement. And at the end of every day, we will provide them an update on what we've done. So that is one way that we approach it. Another way might be as we go from technique to technique. So, when we deliver these, we might start with initial access. We may spend a certain amount of time on initial access. If we're able to get through the perimeter and we're about to move into execution, that normally raises a flag and we'll want to communicate with a customer. Or, and this happens often as well, if we are unable to get through for initial, we're unable to penetrate the boundary of the external network, we will then move inside and begin execution, and we would want to communicate at that point as well. Okay, now we're on TTP preparation. We've got all of our planning done. We've got our documentation order. We know why we're doing it. All that good stuff is good. And now we're going to prepare our TTPs for execution. Important to remember that TTP implementation, it's the substance of threat simulation, right? All we're going to do is like this is some of the most important work that we do because we're just preparing the TTPs to execute them in the environment, right? It's based on behaviors as opposed to fragile indicators like hash values, IP addresses. We talked a little bit about that earlier on. Those things they're quite frankly trivial for the adversary to work around. We want to focus on behaviors. We want to make the adversary, we want to change the trajectory of malops, essentially. We want them to have to do things differently if they want to break into our network because that will deter them from getting into our network. So at this point, we typically put together what's called a TTP outline. This TTP outline will demonstrate. You can see it talks about which tactic we're going to be testing, which techniques we will be using within each one of those tactics. It gives a description of that technique. And then finally, we cite our CTI sources. Again, this is, this needs to be a realistic exercise. For everything that we do, we want to be able to cite relevant threat intelligence. So we don't want to do anything because, we feel like it would be a good idea, because it sounds fun, because we think it would work. We want to do things because they protect you from probable things that are happening in the threat landscape. So if you notice there, one of the techniques under discovery is system network configuration discovery. I've highlighted that one just because it's a simple example. This is our TTP outline. Then we would move into what is called a TTP procedure. And a TTP procedure is, it usually provides, and again, this is not rigid, it usually provides the MITRE attack ID. Where does it set in the tactic, technique, and procedure chain? What is the CTI associated with it? What tools are required? And then what is the procedure for running the tool or running the exploit? Again, this is a very simplistic example just for the purposes of this presentation, but I will tell you, for more complex engagements, you would have all of your binaries and things like that, all put here in your overall TTP procedure. And then you would take your TTP procedure and essentially then you would add it to your planning documentation before you actually start the simulation exercise. Things to think about, as you're documenting your procedures for TTPs, you want to think about things like, how would you mitigate or detect the TTP? Again, a lot of this information is available to you right in MITRE, at least the MITRE attack framework. At least it would give you a good running start in where to look to see what might work. Use a lab environment. Like you can, it's a pretty low risk engagement if you have a lab environment, and I want to be clear, that is completely segmented or even air gapped, better yet, and you have you have a laptop with your EDR solution on it and you want to detonate malware. Do not connect that to your network. But again, it can give you an understanding for how to go about testing whether or not you can detect and defend these with a particular security control. And then I should have highlighted this one and made it about 1,000 times bigger. But, as a part of putting together your TTP procedures, you need to understand and be able to articulate how the technique or how the exploit will affect the system. If you do not understand again, how it could or how it would affect the system, then you are not ready to deploy the exploit. And I would say take a step back and maybe call a partner or do more research, but you really need to understand what the impact will be on the system before you start deploying any kind of simulation exercises in your environment. Okay, now we've got all that stuff ready. We're going to conduct the exercise. And again, this is just a quick way of looking. You can kind of see two different strategies here, and I think I talked about them earlier. If we wanted to execute the simulation exercise in the same manner as Lockbit 3.0 and some of the common affiliates and the TTPs that they use, then we would start on the left-hand side. We would spend time on those initial access techniques that are in scope. We would either breach the perimeter or we would get to a place where we didn't think that we could breach the perimeter in time. And then we would move inside and begin to execute or get into the execution tactic, which is where malware is deployed. Now, you may be asking yourself, Jason, if you can't get in with initial access, why would I let you in to actually execute malware and keep moving through the chain? And the answer is because we've only got a certain amount of time to get to the outside. The bad guy has way more time than us, and we should assume that the adversary could get through your perimeter and get to the inside, and we should continue testing to make sure that you don't have, that your security is not built on a single control set, but it is, solid all the way through the attack chain. So again, that's one way you can do it. You can use the bubbles, go left to right, and simulate a particular threat. Another way to do it is you can say, listen, we want to focus on lateral movement. We want to test, many of the techniques associated with lateral movement to see, we feel like our perimeter is good. We feel like we've got EDR and we've got a good MDR service and they're going to cover us. But you know what, where we're insecure about our security program is with lateral movement. So we're going to test lateral movement for this particular engagement, and we can just go through and test those particular techniques. So all that is to say, you can test left to right, you can test a particular tactic, you can even test in what they call a micro simulation, which is where you just pick one technique, maybe a month, and you go and test that technique. And you see if you can defend and detect that. And then again, this kind of maps out what the process looks like. We pick the techniques, we will execute, whatever technique it is that we're testing. We will obviously review the results. Now, what I'll say is if we are doing this collaboratively with your SOC, which is what we're going to be talking about in the next webinar, is purple teaming. If we're doing this collectively with your SOC, this is like, let's look over the cube and go, hey, did you see that? Did you detect that when I did that? And if you didn't, let's immediately adjust your controls or your analytics, and let's try it again and make sure that you can see it. This is when this process becomes extremely powerful at really moving the needle within your security organization, right? Now, there are times when you would want to do this in a non-collaborative manner. If, for example, you have an MSSP and, you think that they will be able to detect, common threats, but you want to make sure, well, we can come help you make sure that they're able to see that by performing these tests and validating that you get an email or a text message or maybe even a phone call. So it's a good way to do that. That's a good way to do it when you're dealing with perhaps a third party. But even then, once you do it once, it's good to get collaborative with them and really start to, use this process to move your organization forward from a security standpoint. And then, like I said, you want to observe the results. Was the TTP successful? Was it blocked? Was it detected? Were there errors? Errors can be great. We can do a lot with errors as far as detection and understanding what's going on, behind the scenes. So it's, observing the results and keeping an operational log, which we'll talk about momentarily, is incredibly important because it's really what allows you to, or gives you the documentation that you need to make the improvements. All right, this is the last step, and it is report results. There are 3 things that you should expect from a partner if they deliver this simulation for you. Number 1 is operational notes, which will be essentially peppered throughout the report and the executive presentation. You should expect a professional report. It's going to look a lot like a pen test report, but it will have different things like analytics that you might want to employ in your environment and things like that associated with it, and then an executive presentation. Again, it is as important as it is to be able to describe the relevance of the threats that you simulate before you start this engagement. It is equally important that you're able to explain to your executives or to your stakeholders the importance of the findings, because that will get you what you need to move the ball forward with your security program. So operational notes, this is the standard journalism stuff that we're looking for here. Who, what, when, where, and why. What did we do? Who did it? When did we do it? Where were we at? And why did we do it? And we want to keep command transcripts and logs. We want to, all of our screenshots, all of our date timestamps and observations, things that we would expect out of a penetration test report, probably with more rigor, we would want to be included in the operational notes. And then a professional report. This is just an example, but all the things that you would expect to find: description of engagement, objective, scope, some sort of vulnerable or a testing narrative. All of those things should be included in a report of this type. And then finally, an executive presentation is, again, if you have all your operational notes and you have your report, it should be pretty easy to put this together in a way that is conducive to whatever audience you're talking to. So we can put it together for an executive level if you want to take it to the board and talk to them about it, if you want to talk to the CIO about it, or we can make it a more technical presentation if you want to go and talk to your sysadmins and your network defenders about improvements that need to be made. So with that, Amelia, I think that brings us to the end of the presentation. I think I'm right on time, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much, Jason. So I think we have a few questions to get started, which if you haven't dropped any questions in the chat, be sure to do that. We've got Jason here with us for about 15 more minutes. So if you have a question, make sure to remember and drop it in the chat. But let's get started with a few of these here. So Jason, when should this activity be performed collaboratively with the SOC as a purple team? And when should it be performed more as a red team?
Yeah, and I think I touched on this a little bit, but really, I would say, most of the time, you get the most benefit out of this engagement if it's done collaboratively, because when you're able, again, to kind of look across the table at folks that are on the blue team or folks that are conducting your threat simulation exercise and say, did you see that? No, I did not see that. Well, let's go make sure you have the right data sources and analytics in place to allow you to see that. And let's try it again. That's very powerful. But I would say the exception to that would be if you have a third party and you want to identify the gaps that third party has in your coverage initially, perhaps without collaboration. I think it's a good exercise to run to make sure that you're getting the benefit that you think you are from a third party engagement, such as an MSSP.
Okay, that's awesome. Well, speaking of an MSSP, if someone uses an MSSP to monitor their security, should they discuss how to implement a threat-informed defense with them? How does that go down?
Absolutely, 100%. Any MSSP that's worth their salt should know about these concepts. They should be incorporating threat intelligence into how they monitor and defend your environment, and should look forward to a conversation with you about how you can align that threat intel in a way that that provides you the most bang for your buck as far as your monitoring and defensive capabilities.
Okay, awesome. Okay, we've got another one here from Rachel. What are the legal requirements for informing external audiences about a breach, and how does that fit into your communications plan?
Yeah, so I'll keep this, as it relates to the simulation. If we were to come across a breach during simulation, we would want to work within your incident response plan and within your, mechanisms for informing external audiences. It would not be something necessary. It would not be something that we did, but it would be something that we would want to make you aware of so that you could follow your processes and any regulatory requirements or legal requirements that you fall under. So the way that it would work in our communication plan is we would raise our hand very quickly and make sure that you understood what we had found so that you can make an informed decision on what you do with that information, Rachel. And I appreciate the question.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think that looks like all of our questions for today. So we can move on. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us, Jason. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to the next ones. So as we wrap up, we would like to encourage you to keep the conversation around threat simulation going. You can do that by connecting with one of our experts like Jason here at Kirkpatrick Price, or by following the link to our most recent LinkedIn post. We actually have that link pinned in the chat. So go on there and engage with us. Or if you want to unpack this conversation even more, we'd love to come and speak with your org. Connect with us at hello@kirkpatrickprice.com to get started and get connected with someone to make that happen. We want to walk alongside you as you work to fortify your security defenses. So with that, I'd like to remind you about the next part of our 3-part series. Jason will be joined by special guest Michael Bonner to have a conversation around, or let me get here, sorry about that, to have a conversation around purple teaming on May 29th. Mike is the CISO at High Tech Network and Security Solutions, so we are so excited to hear his expertise on purple teaming. Be sure to mark your calendars and please join us as we continue our threat-informed defense series. We hope to see you there. That looks like we've covered everything we have for today, so go and have a great rest of your week.